In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a terror so profound that even the most battle-crazed orcs fall silent in its presence. Across a million war-torn worlds, where the greenskin hordes rampage with gleeful abandon, there walks a golden nightmare that breaks the very foundations of orc psychology. These are the Custodian Dreadnoughts, walking tombs of the Emperor's finest warriors, and they represent something that goes against everything an orc believes about combat, about survival, about the very nature of a good fight. Picture this scene. A wag has descended upon an imperial world, hundreds of thousands of orcs surging forward in a green tide of violence and mayhem. The air reverberates with their savage war cries. The ground shakes beneath the pounding of countless feet and the treads of ramshackle war machines. Bullets fill the air like metal rain. Explosions bloom across the battlefield like deadly flowers. And the orcs are doing what they love most, fighting with every fiber of their fungal being. They are in their element, surrounded by the chaos and carnage that defines their existence. Then it arrives. Through the smoke and fire, a towering figure of burnished gold strides onto the battlefield, standing twice the height of even the largest knob, moving with a grace that seems impossible for something so massive. The Custodian Dreadnought enters the fray. Its armor gleams even through the grime of war, each plate handcrafted by the finest artificers of the Imperium, worked upon by the Emperor's own hands in ages past. In one massive fist, it wields weapons that dwarf those carried by standard Space Marine dreadnoughts, weapons whose names are whispered in awe, even by those who fight alongside them. And something happens that should be impossible. The orcs hesitate. Not all of them, not at first, but there is a pause, a momentary break in the endless forward momentum of the green tide. The bravest or most foolish orcs charge forward, roaring their challenges, convinced that this golden giant will provide the fight they crave. They meet the dreadnought's response with shells that could punch through tank armor, with energy blades that can cleave through bunkers, with weapons so advanced that they seem to tear at the very fabric of reality. The first wave of orcs dies in seconds, not minutes, not even a full minute, but seconds. They are not simply killed, but utterly obliterated, their bodies reduced to component atoms by weaponry that operates on principles most tech priests can barely comprehend. The Custodian Dreadnought doesn't slow, doesn't pause to savor victory, doesn't engage in the back and forth that orcs live for. It simply advances, and everything in its path ceases to exist. This is when the wag begins to fracture. This is when something fundamental in the orc psyche starts to break down. Because what orcs see before them isn't just a powerful enemy, it's something that violates the core tenets of their existence. The Custodian Dreadnought doesn't fight for the joy of combat. It doesn't seek glory or prove its strength through struggle. It simply executes its duty with a cold, perfect efficiency that no amount of orc cunning can overcome, no amount of numbers can overwhelm, no amount of belief in Gork and Mork can counter. To understand why this golden war machine strikes such terror into creatures that live for battle, we need to delve deep into the nature of both orcs and custodians. We need to examine the psychology of a species engineered by the Old Ones to be the perfect warriors, and how that psychology encounters something it was never designed to face. We need to explore the history of conflicts where Custodian dreadnoughts have faced greenskin hordes, battles that have left scars not just on the worlds where they were fought, but in the genetic memory of the orc species itself. This is not simply a story of superior technology facing primitive brutality, though that is certainly part of it. This is a tale of how fear can take root even in hearts that were crafted to know no such emotion, how the unstoppable force of orc aggression meets the immovable object of custodian perfection, and how that meeting creates something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. The orcs were made to fight. The custodians were made to be perfect. When these two creations meet on the battlefield, when an orc finds itself facing not just a custodian, but the ancient, entombed fury of a Custodian dreadnought. Something breaks. The wah! Energy that binds them together and drives them forward meets a force it cannot comprehend, cannot overcome, cannot incorporate into its understanding of how battle works. And in that breaking, in that moment of incomprehension, fear takes root. Understanding Ork psychology and the nature of fear. To comprehend why Custodian dreadnoughts inspire such profound terror in Orks, we must first understand what Orks are at their core, how they think, and what it takes to make them feel something approaching fear. This requires us to examine not just the individual Ork, but the collective psychic phenomenon that binds them together and drives them across the galaxy in an endless quest for violence. Orks are not like other species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They were engineered by the ancient Old Ones during the war in heaven, designed to be the perfect soldiers in a cosmic conflict that would dwarf any war fought in the current age. The Old Ones, master bioengineers with knowledge that has been lost to the mists of time, created the Orks with a very specific purpose. They needed warriors who would breed rapidly, fight ferociously, and require minimal logistical support. What they created was perhaps too perfect for their own good, a species that would outlast its creators and spread across the galaxy like an unstoppable green tide. The fundamental truth about Orks is this: they love combat more than life itself. This isn't a cultural trait or a learned behavior. It's encoded into their very genes, woven into the fabric of their being at a molecular level. An Ork doesn't fight to achieve objectives, or secure resources, or protect territory, although these things may happen as side effects of their violence. An Ork fights because fighting is what makes them feel alive, what brings them joy, what gives their existence meaning. They are perhaps the only species in the galaxy for whom war is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. This creates a psychology that is utterly alien to most other races. Where humans might fear death, Orks see it as simply the end of a good scrap. Where Eldar might fear the loss of their souls, Orks have no such concerns, believing that Gork and Mork will provide them with eternal battle in the afterlife. Where Tau might fear the failure of the greater good, Orks don't even have a concept of failure in the way other species understand it. To an Ork, if you win, you win. If you die fighting, which doesn't count as losing. And if you run away, well, that just means you get to come back for another go later. This last point is crucial to understanding Ork psychology. Orks do retreat, despite what many might believe. They are not suicidally brave or incapable of recognizing when a battle is going poorly. What makes them different is how they rationalize retreat. To an Ork, running away isn't an admission of defeat. It's a tactical decision that allows them to return to the fight later, hopefully with more boys and better weapons. This is particularly true of the Blood Axes clan, who have adopted many human military tactics, including organized retreats and regrouping. Other Orks might call them cowardly, but the Blood Axes understand that you can't have a good fight if you're dead. However, this rationalization only works when certain conditions are met. An Ork can retreat and maintain their sense of self if they believe they'll get another chance at a proper scrap. What breaks an Ork isn't simply losing a fight, it's encountering something that makes them believe there will be no more fights to be had, no chance for revenge, no possibility of coming back stronger. This is where the wah energy comes into play. The wah is perhaps the most important factor in understanding Ork psychology. It's a gestalt psychic field generated by groups of Orks, growing stronger as more greenskins gather together. This field serves multiple purposes, all of which are crucial to Ork society and combat effectiveness. First, it allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is bigger and therefore in charge. Size equals power in Ork society, but it's not just physical size that matters. The WAG field amplifies the psychic presence of larger, more dominant orcs, creating a feedback loop where the biggest orc attracts more followers, which generates more WAG energy, which makes them seem even bigger and more imposing. Second, the WAG field has a profound effect on orc technology. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus have documented countless instances where orc weapons only function when wielded by orcs themselves. A captured orc shooter might be nothing more than a collection of scrap metal and spare parts when examined by human hands. Yet, in the grip of an orc, it becomes a devastatingly effective weapon. The prevailing theory is that the WAG field literally makes orc technology work through a form of collective belief. If enough orcs believe that painting a vehicle red makes it go faster, the WAG energy makes it so. If they believe that their guns should work, they do. Third, and most relevant to our discussion, the WAG field affects orc morale and courage. The more orcs that gather in one place, the stronger the WAG becomes, and the more fearless they all become. This creates a snowball effect, where a successful orc warband attracts more orcs, which makes them stronger, which leads to more victories, which attracts even more orcs. A proper WAG, led by a powerful war boss, can grow to encompass billions of greenskins, sweeping across star systems and leaving devastation in its wake. But this collective courage is also a vulnerability. Because orc bravery is tied to the WAG field and the presence of their fellows, anything that disrupts this field or isolates an orc from the mob can have catastrophic effects on their morale. Kill the war boss and the WAG loses its focal point. The energy that was driving the orcs forward suddenly has no direction, no purpose. The greenskins begin to fight amongst themselves to determine who's in charge, or they scatter in confusion, each group going its own way. This is where things get interesting when we consider Custodian Dreadnoughts. These golden war machines don't just kill orcs efficiently, they seem to have an effect on the WAG field itself. Multiple accounts from Imperial commanders describe how orc advances falter when a Custodian Dreadnought enters the battlefield, how the greenskin war cries become less enthusiastic, how the tide of bodies slows even before the Dreadnought has engaged in combat. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos have theorized that the psychic presence of the Custodian within the Dreadnought, amplified by the sacred nature of the machine itself, creates a kind of anti-WAG field. The absolute certainty of purpose, the unwavering dedication to duty, the sheer perfection embodied by a Custodian warrior. These qualities seem to act as a nullifying force against the chaotic, emotion-driven energy of the WAG. Where the greenskin field feeds on excitement and aggression and the joy of battle, the Custodian represents something colder, more absolute, more terrible in its focused lethality. When an orc encounters an enemy that fights with skill and strength, they get excited. This is a proper challenge, a chance to prove their own might. When they encounter an enemy with superior numbers, they see it as more targets to crump. When they face advanced technology, they see it as more gubbins to loot. But when they encounter a Custodian Dreadnought, something in their genetic programming, something woven into them by the old ones millions of years ago, sends up warning signals. This is not an enemy you can beat through numbers. This is not an enemy you can outsmart or outfight. This is not an enemy that will give you a good scrap and maybe let you escape if things go badly. This is perfection made manifest, and perfection doesn't leave room for comebacks or second chances. The Custodian. Dreadnought will kill you, and it will do so with such overwhelming efficiency that you won't even have time to enjoy the fight. And for an orc, encountering an enemy that promises not just death, but a boring, one-sided, completely unsatisfying death, that's when fear begins to creep in. Not the fear of dying, they've never cared about that, but the fear of dying without purpose, without glory, without even the basic satisfaction of a good scrap. The fear that their existence will end not in a blaze of glorious combat, but in cold, mechanical slaughter. This psychological vulnerability is amplified when we consider how Orks process loss. When a mob of Orks loses a fight to Imperial Guard, they might retreat, but they'll come back with more boys and better weapons, eager for revenge. When they lose to Space Marines, they respect the power of these warriors and relish the challenge of fighting them again. But when they encounter a Custodian Dreadnought and watch it tear through their ranks without effort, without even seeming to notice their presence, something breaks in their understanding of how combat works. The wag energy that normally sustains them in battle, that makes them brave and fierce and eager for violence, encounters something it cannot process. The collective psychic field that tells them they can win any fight through strength and numbers crashes against a reality where neither strength nor numbers matter. And in that moment of cognitive dissonance, when what they believe about combat collides with what a Custodian Dreadnought actually represents, fear finds purchase in minds that were engineered to know only aggression. It's important to note that this fear manifests differently than it would in other species. An Ork doesn't become paralyzed with terror or flee in mindless panic the way a human might. Instead, the fear shows itself through hesitation, through a sudden unwillingness to charge forward with their usual abandon, through the wah cry that comes out just a bit less enthusiastic than it should be. It manifests in knobs who suddenly find pressing business elsewhere, in mobs that mysteriously develop mechanical problems with their vehicles, in war bosses who decide that actually, this particular battle isn't worth the effort. The Greenskins have even developed terminology for this phenomenon, though they would never admit. It's fear. They talk about enemies that ain't no fun to fight, or battles that ain't worth the bother. They'll explain their retreat by saying they need to go find better weapons or gather more boys. And to an extent, this is true. But the underlying reality is that when faced with a Custodian Dreadnought, something in the Ork psyche recognizes that this is a fight they cannot win, cannot enjoy, and cannot learn from. And that recognition, that moment of understanding that they face something truly beyond their ability to overcome, is as close to existential dread as an Ork can experience. What makes Custodian Dreadnoughts unique? To truly appreciate why Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire such fear in Orks, we must understand what sets these golden war machines apart from every other Dreadnought pattern in the Imperium. The differences are not merely cosmetic or a matter of superior craftsmanship, though both of those factors certainly play a role. The gap between a Custodian Dreadnought and a standard Space Marine Dreadnought is comparable to the gap between a Space Marine and a baseline human, a chasm so vast that they barely belong in the same category of war machine. The story begins with the Custodians themselves, the legendary Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000 who stand guard over the Emperor of mankind. These warriors are not simply enhanced humans or even super soldiers in the way that Space Marines are. Each Custodian is a unique work of art, a masterpiece of genetic engineering that takes decades to create and cannot be mass-produced. Where a Space Marine is created through a relatively standardized process of implanting gene seed and organs, a Custodian is built from the ground up at a genetic level, each one individually crafted to be as close to perfection as mortal flesh can achieve. The Emperor himself oversaw the creation of the Custodians, using secrets of genetic alchemy that have been lost even to the most learned members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These are not warriors who have been augmented to superhuman levels. They are humans who have been rebuilt to be superior in every measurable way. Their strength, speed, intelligence, reflexes, and even their capacity for learning and adaptation exist on a level that makes even veteran Space Marines seem crude by comparison. A Custodian doesn't just fight better than a Space Marine. They think faster, adapt more quickly, and possess an almost precognitive ability to read the flow of battle. More importantly, each Custodian is psychologically engineered with the same care as their physical form. Their loyalty to the Emperor goes beyond indoctrination or faith. It's woven into their very being at a level deeper than conscious thought. Their sense of duty, their commitment to perfection, their unwavering focus on their mission. These aren't learned behaviors, but fundamental aspects of their existence. A custodian cannot waver, cannot doubt, cannot fail in their dedication because that dedication is as much a part of them as their own heartbeat. This is crucial to understanding what happens when a custodian is interred within a dreadnought. Unlike space marines, who may embrace their new existence or rage against it, custodians accept this transformation with the same calm certainty they bring to every aspect of their service. The transition from flesh to metal doesn't diminish them. In many ways, it represents a new form of dedication to their eternal vigil. Where a space marine might struggle with the psychological trauma of being entombed in a walking sarcophagus, a custodian simply continues their duty in a new form. The physical dreadnought chassis itself reflects this superiority. At the time of the outbreak of the Horus heresy, fewer than perhaps 100 custodian dreadnoughts existed in the entire Legio Custodes. Each one was constructed using materials and technologies far beyond even what the vaunted Forge Worlds could produce for the Space Marine legions. The armor plates aren't simply thick ceramite, but handcrafted auramite, a golden alloy whose exact composition remains a mystery, even to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each plate bears inscriptions worked by the Emperor's own hand, benedictions and wards that serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The three primary patterns of Custodian Dreadnought each serve different tactical roles, but all share the same fundamental superiority over their Space Marine counterparts. The Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought is the most common variant, though common is a relative term when discussing machines that number in the dozens rather than thousands. This general battle unit combines phenomenal strength and speed with the echoes of the interred custodian's own unmatched martial skill. Armed with a massive Achilles dread spear, a weapon that functions as both ranged and close combat armament, the Contemptor Achilles can engage enemies at any range with devastating effectiveness. The dread spear itself deserves special mention, as it represents everything that makes custodian weapons superior to standard Imperial armaments. This is not simply a scaled-up version of a Guardian spear. It's a unique creation that incorporates technologies most tech priests can only dream of understanding. The weapon's power field can shear through the thickest armor with contemptuous ease, while its built-in Corvée Las Pulsar provides ranged firepower that can punch through bunker walls. In the hands, or rather the grip, of a custodian dreadnought, this weapon becomes an extension of the warrior's will, wielded with a grace and precision that seems impossible for something so massive. The Contemptor Galatus Dreadnought serves a different role, designed to provide a mobile anchor point for custodian battle lines. Where the Achilles excels at aggressive assault, the Galatus is built to hold ground against overwhelming odds. Its signature weapon is the immense Galatus Warblade, a power sword large, enough to cleave a Lehman Russ battle tank in half, fitted with twin-linked Infernus incinerators that can purge entire squads of enemies in seconds. But the Galatus's most significant feature is its Presidium shield, an energy-reinforced barrier so powerful that it makes an already nigh indestructible chassis effectively invulnerable to all but the most devastating firepower. This shield technology deserves particular attention because it represents a level of defensive capability that goes beyond anything available to standard dreadnought patterns. Where a Space Marine dreadnought might mount extra armor plates or an ion shield, the Presidium shield creates a defensive field so robust that it can withstand sustained fire from anti-tank weapons without faltering. Combined with the Galatus's already formidable armor and the advanced shielding systems built into all custodian dreadnoughts, this makes the machine capable of advancing through fire that would reduce lesser war engines to scrap metal. Then there is the Telemann Heavy Dreadnought, the rarest and most powerful pattern of all. Fewer than a handful of these massive war machines existed during the Horus Heresy, and whether any still serve in the 41st millennium remains uncertain. The Telemon stands larger than even other Custodian dreadnoughts, towering over the battlefield like a golden giant. Each one was intended to stand sentinel over its charges, no matter what force might be brought against it, and they were equipped with weapons that justify this lofty purpose. The Telemon can mount an array of devastating armaments, from Iliastus accelerator culverins that spit streams of hypervelocity projectiles capable of shredding heavy armor, to massive Telemon Cestus power fists fitted with built-in plasma projectors. The signature weapon, however, is the Arachnus Storm Cannon, a twin-linked Gatling pattern weapon that uses las cannons as its individual barrels. Let that sink in for a moment. Each barrel of this weapon fires with the power of a las cannon, and it has multiple barrels spinning at high speed, creating a storm of armor-piercing death that few targets can withstand. The honor of interment in a Telemon sarcophagus was awarded only to the most celebrated warriors within the sodalities of the Legio Custodes. Until a worthy candidate found their end in battle, these dreadnoughts stood silent and empty, waiting for a custodian whose deeds and skill merited such a prestigious tomb. When a Telemon enters battle, it doesn't simply fight, it dominates the battlefield with a presence that is as much psychological as physical. What makes all these dreadnought patterns truly superior, however, isn't just their weapons and armor. It's the sophisticated systems that connect the custodian within to the machine itself. Where a Space Marine dreadnought pilot must learn to operate their new body, often struggling with the transition from flesh to metal, a custodian integrates with their chassis in a way that makes the machine feel like a natural extension of their consciousness. The neural interfaces are so advanced, so perfectly attuned to the custodian's enhanced nervous system, that there is virtually no lag between thought and action. This creates a responsiveness that seems impossible in something so large and heavily armored. A Custodian dreadnought can dodge attacks that would pulverize a Space Marine dreadnought, can react to threats with speed that belies its size, can execute combat maneuvers that require precision down to the millimeter. It's not uncommon for observers to report that Custodian dreadnoughts move with a grace more reminiscent of power-armored infantry than walking tanks, flowing through combat with an elegance that makes them seem almost alive in a way that transcends mere mechanical function. The sensory systems are equally advanced. While a Space Marine dreadnought pilot sees the world through relatively crude optical sensors and Auspex arrays, a Custodian dreadnought possesses detection systems that border on the miraculous. They can perceive threats across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, can detect minute changes in air pressure that indicate enemy movement, can even sense the psychic emanations of living beings. This level of battlefield awareness means that surprising a Custodian dreadnought is effectively impossible. They know you're there before you know they're there. Perhaps most importantly, each Custodian dreadnought bears at least one plate worked by the Emperor's own hand. This isn't merely symbolic or decorative. The Emperor's touch imbued these machines with properties that cannot be fully explained by material science or engineering principles. There are accounts of Custodian dreadnoughts shrugging off hits that should have penetrated their armor, of weapons malfunctioning when fired at these golden war machines, of enemies experiencing sudden equipment failures or loss of morale when faced with these avatars of the Emperor's will. The combination of all these factors creates a war machine that exists in a category entirely separate from standard Imperial dreadnoughts. A Space Marine dreadnought is a valuable asset, a walking tank that can turn the tide of battle. A Custodian dreadnought is a force of nature, an unstoppable golden avatar of the Emperor's wrath that can single-handedly break enemy armies. Where it might take several Space Marine dreadnoughts to hold a critical position or break through enemy lines, a single Custodian dreadnought can accomplish the same task with contemptuous ease. This superiority manifests in every aspect of combat. In ranged engagement, Their weapons hit harder, fire faster, and strike with unerring accuracy. In close combat, their power fists and blades carve through enemy armor like it's parchment. Their armor withstands punishment that would obliterate lesser machines. Their speed allows them to reposition faster than enemies can react. And underlying all of this is the will of the custodian within, a warrior whose skill and experience would make them legendary even in their original body, now amplified by the power of their mechanical form. For an orc facing such a war machine, the experience is fundamentally different from encountering a Space Marine dreadnought. When greenskins fight Space Marine dreadnoughts, they recognize a powerful enemy, but one that operates on understandable principles. It's big, it's tough, it hits hard, but these are all things orcs can comprehend and respond to. Bring more boys, use more dakka, hit it harder. These are solutions that make sense in the orc worldview. But a Custodian dreadnought doesn't just hit harder or have better armor. It operates on a different level entirely, with a perfection and efficiency that breaks the orc understanding of how combat should work. It doesn't lumber into position, it moves with predatory grace. It doesn't spray fire wildly. Every shot finds its mark. It doesn't engage in the back and forth of battle. It simply executes its enemies with surgical precision. And most terrifying of all, it does all of this without apparent effort, without strain, without any indication that the orcs represent even a minor challenge. This is what makes Custodian dreadnoughts unique among Imperial war machines, and this is what makes them objects of terror for a species that was engineered to love battle above all else. Physical supremacy, size, strength, and armor. The physical presence of a Custodian dreadnought on the battlefield is something that must be experienced to be truly understood. Accounts from both Imperial forces and those rare orc survivors who have witnessed these golden war machines describe an almost supernatural aura of power and menace. To comprehend why orcs react with such uncharacteristic fear, we must examine the sheer physical dominance these machines represent, the overwhelming superiority in every measurable aspect of combat capability. Let us begin with size, because in orc culture, size matters more than almost anything else. The entire social structure of greenskin society is based on a simple principle. The biggest orc is the boss. This isn't just cultural tradition, it's wired into their genetic code through the WH field, which allows orcs to instinctively recognize who's bigger and therefore in charge. An orc warboss can stand over 3 meters tall, towering over their smaller brethren, and this physical stature is what gives them authority and respect. A Custodian dreadnought makes even the largest warboss look like a child. Standard contemptor pattern. Dreadnoughts already stand approximately 5 meters tall, and Custodian variants are notably larger than their Space Marine counterparts, pushing closer to 6 meters in height. The Telemon Heavy Dreadnought dwarfs even this, standing tall enough that some observers have mistaken them for small Imperial knights at a distance. This massive stature isn't stature, just impressive. It's psychologically devastating to orcs, who are programmed to defer to size and strength. But raw height tells only part of the story. A Custodian dreadnought isn't just tall, it's massive in every dimension. The chassis is broader, the limbs thicker, the overall bulk substantially greater than standard dreadnought patterns. Where a Space Marine dreadnought might weigh several tons, a Custodian dreadnought weighs substantially more due to its superior armor and construction. This additional mass translates directly into combat effectiveness. When a Custodian dreadnought charges, the ground shakes beneath its weight, and anything caught in its path is simply crushed beneath several tons of blessed auramite and righteous fury. The strength of these war machines defies easy description. A standard Space Marine dreadnought possesses enough power to tear apart enemy tanks with its power fist, to rend thick armor plating like tissue paper. A Custodian dreadnought can do all of this and more, with a casual ease that makes observers wonder if they're truly exerting any effort at all. There are recorded instances of Contemptor Achilles dreadnoughts impaling enemy super heavy vehicles on their dread spears and then tossing the wreckage aside as if it weighed nothing. Telemann heavy dreadnoughts have been observed ripping the main guns off Ork gargants and using them as improvised clubs to beat their former owners to scrap. This overwhelming physical power manifests in combat in ways that are simply incomprehensible to enemies who haven't witnessed it firsthand. When a Custodian Dreadnought's power fist connects with an enemy, it doesn't just destroy the target, it obliterates it utterly. Ork meganobs, who normally shrug off hits that would kill lesser greenskins, are reduced to paste in a single blow. Ork vehicles, which are already barely held together by scrap metal and belief, simply disintegrate when struck by these massive weapons. The sheer kinetic energy involved in these attacks is enough to send shockwaves through nearby combatants, knocking smaller orcs off their feet even if they weren't directly targeted. The armor plating that covers these walking fortresses represents another level of superiority that sets Custodian dreadnoughts apart. The auramite used in their construction is not merely thicker or better quality ceramite. It's a fundamentally different material, whose exact composition remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. This golden alloy possesses properties that seem to defy conventional physics, demonstrating resilience that goes beyond what can be explained by simple material science. Standard anti-tank weapons that would punch through Space Marine dreadnought armor often bounce off Custodian chassis or penetrate only superficially. Ork rockets, crude but effective weapons that can disable enemy vehicles with alarming regularity, detonate harmlessly against auramite plating. Even dedicated, anti-armor weapons like custom mega blasters, which can reduce other targets to molten slag, struggle to inflict meaningful damage on these golden war machines. The few scratches and dents that do make it through the armor are often cosmetic, barely penetrating the multiple layers of protection. But the armor itself is only part of the defensive equation. Custodian dreadnoughts are equipped with advanced energy shielding systems that would make even the most sophisticated Tau technology seem primitive by comparison. These shields don't simply absorb or deflect incoming fire. They actively redistribute the energy of attacks across the entire chassis, ensuring that no single point becomes a weakness. When combined with the innate durability of the auramite armor, this creates a defensive capability that borders on the supernatural. The Contemptor Galautus pattern takes this defensive capability to an entirely new level with its Presidium shield. This massive energy-reinforced barrier is essentially a scaled-up version of the shields carried by Custodian Sentinel guards, but the enhancement isn't linear, it's exponential. The shield doesn't just protect the dreadnought, it creates a defensive field so powerful that it can weather sustained fire from multiple heavy weapons simultaneously without faltering. There are accounts of Galautus dreadnoughts advancing through barrages that would level entire city blocks, their shields blazing with absorbed energy, never slowing their inexorable march toward the enemy. What makes this defensive capability particularly terrifying for orcs is how it interacts with their understanding of combat. In the greenskin worldview, everything can be destroyed if you hit it hard enough and often enough. This principle has served them well throughout their existence. No matter how tough an enemy might be, enough Daka will eventually bring it down. But Custodian dreadnoughts challenge this fundamental assumption. Ork mobs that would normally overwhelm tough enemies through sheer weight of fire watch in horror as their bullets and shells simply fail to have any appreciable effect on these golden giants. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Imagine being an orc, genetically programmed to believe that you can overcome any obstacle through strength and numbers, and then encountering an enemy that your strength cannot harm and your numbers cannot overwhelm. Every shot that bounces off the armor, every explosion that dissipates harmlessly against the shields, every blow that fails to even scratch the auramite plating, all of these failures chip away at the WAG energy that sustains orc morale. Speed and agility might seem like strange qualities to emphasize when discussing something as massive as a dreadnought, but this is another area where Custodian variants demonstrate their superiority. Space Marine dreadnoughts, while formidable, move with the deliberate pace one would expect from a walking tank. They can charge and engage in close combat, certainly, but their movements have a certain mechanical quality, a predictability that experienced enemies can exploit. Custodian Dreadnoughts move differently. The advanced neural interfaces that connect the entombed warrior to their mechanical body allow for a responsiveness that seems impossible in something so massive. These war machines can dodge incoming fire, can weave through enemy formations, can execute combat maneuvers that would seem more at home in a duel between skilled swordsmen than in a clash between armored vehicles. This agility is not just impressive, it's actively unsettling to observe, creating an uncanny valley effect where the dreadnought seems simultaneously too large to move with such grace, and undeniably doing exactly that. For orcs, who rely heavily on overwhelming their enemies through sheer aggression and weight of numbers, this agility presents an almost insoluble problem. Their usual tactic of surrounding an enemy and beating it to death through concentrated attacks fails when the enemy can simply move out of the way faster than they can reposition. Orc knobs, who would normally be able to land devastating power, claw strikes, find themselves swinging at empty air as the dreadnought sidesteps with contemptuous ease. Vehicles attempting to ram these golden war machines discover too late that their target isn't where they expected it to be, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. The combination of all these physical attributes creates a war machine that is, for all practical purposes, unstoppable by conventional orc tactics. It's too large to be intimidated, too heavily armored to be damaged by standard weapons, too strong to be physically overpowered, and too fast to be caught or surrounded. Every aspect of its design works in perfect harmony to create a killing machine that exists beyond the normal parameters of combat. Consider the experience from an orc's perspective. You're part of a massive mob, hundreds or thousands of boys strong, all of you charging forward with weapons blazing, ready to crump whatever gets in your way. This is what you were made for. This is what brings you joy. This is the entire purpose of your existence. And then, this golden giant appears in front of you, and you watch as your bullets fail to penetrate its armor, as your fellow orcs are swatted aside like insects, as the very ground shakes beneath its massive footfalls. You've seen Space Marine dreadnoughts before, maybe even fought them. Those were tough fights, but they made sense. You knew you could hurt them if you hit them enough times, knew they could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers, knew they moved in predictable patterns that you could exploit. But this thing, this golden nightmare, doesn't follow those rules. It shrugs off damage that should cripple it. It moves with a grace that seems impossible, and it kills with an efficiency that suggests you're not even worth its full attention. And, perhaps most terrifying of all, you realize that it's not slowing down. Your mob has been reduced by half, then by 2/3, then to scattered survivors, and the Custodian dreadnought hasn't even paused. It simply continues its advance, stepping over the bodies of your fellow orcs, its weapons never ceasing their deadly work, its golden armor unmarred despite the thousands of rounds that have struck it. This is the physical reality of facing a Custodian dreadnought, and it's a reality that breaks something fundamental in the orc psyche. Because if you can't hurt it, can't slow it down, can't even make it acknowledge you as a threat, then what's the point of fighting? And when an orc starts asking that question, when the joy of combat turns to the realization that this isn't a fight, but a slaughter, that's when fear takes root. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, Historical Foundation. To understand why Custodian dreadnoughts inspire such deep-seated terror in the orc species, we must look back to a pivotal moment in Imperial history, a battle that carved itself into the genetic memory of the greenskin race and established a precedent that echoes across the millennia. The Battle of Gyros Thravian stands as perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Custodian superiority over orc forces, a conflict where the Emperor's golden guardians proved their worth in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The campaign took place in the last century of the 30th millennium, during the golden age of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor still walked among his armies and the dream of a unified human galaxy seemed within reach. The Imperium had encountered many Ork warlords during its expansion across the stars, greenskin leaders of varying power and cunning who commanded wags of different sizes and ferocity. But Garkle Blackfang represented something unprecedented, one of the most powerful Ork leaders ever encountered up to that time, a war boss whose strength and tactical acumen had carved out a greenskin empire that threatened to engulf entire sectors. The Imperium's response to this threat was commensurately massive. 3 full Space Marine legions were deployed to face the Ork menace: the Lunar Wolves, led by Primarch Horus himself, the Death Guard under Primarch Mortarion, and the Imperial Fists, commanded by Primarch Rogel Dawn. These weren't merely 3 legions of ordinary soldiers. These were hundreds of thousands of the Emperor's finest warriors, led by 3 of his own sons, demigod generals whose names would echo through history. The Imperium had assembled a force that should have been more than sufficient to crush any Ork, no matter how large or well led. Yet despite the presence of 3 Primarchs and their legions, despite the tactical genius of commanders who had conquered hundreds of worlds, despite the overwhelming firepower and skill of the Astartes forces, the Imperium found itself on the verge of defeat. Garkle Blackfang had proven to be a more formidable opponent than anyone had anticipated. His Ork hordes vastly outnumbered the Imperial forces, and more concerning, they displayed a level of coordination and tactical sophistication unusual for greenskins. The battle had devolved into a brutal slugging match, with both sides taking horrific casualties and neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The Space Marine legions, despite their legendary prowess, were being ground down by sheer numbers. For every 100 Orks they killed, 1,000 more seemed to take their place. The Primarchs found themselves in the unusual position of facing an enemy they could not simply overwhelm through superior skill and power. The energy generated by such a massive gathering of Orks had reached apocalyptic proportions, driving the greenskins into a frenzy of violence that made them nearly unstoppable. Victory, which had seemed assured at the campaign's outset, now appeared increasingly distant. This was the situation when the Emperor himself decided to intervene. From his flagship, the mighty battleship Bucephalus, the master of mankind observed the deteriorating situation and made a decision that would become legendary. He would not simply provide orbital support or coordinate strategy from afar. The Emperor would personally lead a strike force into the heart of the Ork horde, bringing with him 1,000 of his Custodian guard, the finest warriors ever created by human hands. 1,000 Custodians. Not millions of Imperial Army soldiers, not tens of thousands of Space Marines, but 1,000 golden armored warriors who had never known defeat, who had stood guard over the Emperor since before the Imperium's founding, who represented the pinnacle of what the Emperor could create when he focused his full genius on crafting the perfect warrior. It seemed almost contemptuous in its confidence, bringing such a small force against a that numbered in the hundreds of thousands at minimum, perhaps millions. The Emperor and his Custodians struck at the very heart of the Ork horde, not attempting to grind down the greenskin forces through attrition, but going directly for the head of the beast. They fought their way through wave after wave of Orks, the golden Custodians carving through the greenskin masses like a blade through cloth. The accounts from surviving Imperial forces describe a scene almost beyond comprehension. 1,000 warriors in gleaming gold advancing through an ocean of green-skinned enemies, never slowing, never faltering, leaving a trail of Ork corpses in their wake. The Emperor himself confronted Garkle Blackfang atop a towering gargant, the massive war machine that served as the war boss's mobile fortress and symbol of his power. The details of that duel have been recorded in numerous Imperial texts, though the accounts vary in their specifics. What all sources agree on is the outcome. The Emperor decapitated the giant, black-skinned orc with a single stroke, ending the threat of one of the most powerful green-skin leaders the Imperium had yet encountered. But it wasn't just the Emperor's personal prowess that broke the orc. Wag! While he engaged the war boss, the Custodians laid waste to Garkel's elite warriors, the largest and most experienced orcs in the Horde, the veterans and champions who formed the core of the war boss's power. The Golden Warriors moved through the orc elite like death incarnate, their guardian spears and power weapons reaping a toll that defied belief. These were the biggest, toughest, most skilled orcs in the entire WH, warriors who had survived countless battles and proven their worth in combat. The Custodians annihilated them. The numbers from that engagement have become the stuff of legend, repeated in Imperial histories and whispered around orc campfires alike. Within moments, over 100,000 greenskins died, not over the course of hours or even a full battle, but in the span of minutes, possibly seconds, depending on which account you believe. 100,000 orcs cut down by 1,000 Custodians in a display of martial excellence that has never been equaled. And the cost to the Custodians? 3. Only 3 of the Emperor's Golden Guardians fell in that engagement, their names forever engraved upon the Emperor's own armor in recognition of their sacrifice. 3 warriors lost in exchange for 100,000 enemy dead and the complete collapse of a WH that had threatened multiple sectors. The mathematics of that exchange ratio are almost impossible to process. Each Custodian who participated in that battle accounted for, on average, 100 orc kills, though in reality the distribution was likely uneven, with some killing dozens and others killing hundreds. The immediate tactical impact of the Emperor's intervention was the breaking of the WAG. With their war boss dead and their elite warriors slaughtered, the orcs lost the focal point that had held them together and given them purpose. The WAH! Energy that had sustained their courage and coordination evaporated like morning mist. The remaining greenskins, still vastly outnumbering the Imperial forces, didn't stand and fight to the last. They broke. They fled. The species that was engineered to love combat above all else, that would normally fight to the death rather than retreat, scattered in confusion and panic. This panic wasn't just a temporary battlefield rout that would be forgotten once the orcs regrouped. Something deeper happened at Gyros Thravian, something that affected the orc species at a fundamental level. The genetic memory that orcs possess, the instinctive knowledge passed down through their spores, incorporated the lessons of that battle. The image of golden warriors cutting through unstoppable masses of orcs became embedded in the greenskin psyche in a way that transcended individual experience. Orcs don't have written histories or oral traditions in the way other species do. Their knowledge of the past comes from genetic memory, instincts encoded in their very biology that guide their behavior and understanding of the universe. After Gyros Thravian, that genetic memory included a new entry, a warning encoded at the deepest level. Golden warriors are death incarnate. This wasn't conscious knowledge that orcs could articulate or explain. It was something deeper, a primal reaction that would manifest whenever they encountered the Emperor's Custodians. The strategic implications of this engagement extended far beyond the immediate victory. Throughout the Great Crusade and in the millennia since, orc WAHs that encountered Custodian forces have shown unusual hesitance, a reluctance to engage that other enemies don't observe. Orc war bosses who would charge headlong at Space Marine battle lines have been known to pause when Custodians appear on the battlefield. Greenskin mobs that would normally overwhelm enemy positions through sheer numbers have faltered when faced with golden armored warriors, even when those warriors numbered only in the dozens or hundreds. This genetic terror became even more pronounced when Custodian Dreadnoughts entered the equation. If a single Custodian on foot could reap such a terrible toll, what happened when that warrior was encased in a walking fortress of blessed auramite, armed with weapons that made their already formidable guardian spears seem like toys in comparison. The answer, as Orks discovered in countless subsequent engagements, was that the slaughter became even more one-sided, even more overwhelming, even more soul-crushing in its efficiency. The Battle of Gyros-Thravian established a template that would be repeated across the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. Whenever Custodians engage Ork forces, the results are devastatingly one-sided. The exchange ratios might not always reach the legendary heights of that first great battle, but they consistently favor the Golden Warriors to a degree that defies conventional military logic. And when those warriors are entombed in Dreadnought chassis, when their already formidable capabilities are amplified by armor and weapons that put even other Imperial war machines to shame, the results become almost farcical in their disparity. Imagine being an Ork war boss in the 41st Millennium, standing before your assembled WH, ready to lead your boys to another glorious battle. You've fought countless enemies, conquered dozens of worlds, proven your might against Space Marines and Imperial Guard and every other race in the galaxy. And then you receive reports of Golden Warriors on the battlefield. Something in your genetic memory, knowledge you didn't know you possessed, sends a shiver through your massive frame. You remember, though you've never experienced it yourself, what happened when 1,000 Golden Warriors met 100,000 Orks. This is the legacy of Gyros-Thravian, a single battle that cast a shadow across 10,000 years of warfare. It established, at a fundamental level that transcends conscious thought or rational analysis, that Custodians represent a threat beyond what Orks are equipped to handle. And when those Custodians pilot Dreadnoughts, when they become walking avatars of that ancient slaughter, the terror only intensifies. The Orks who survived Gyros-Thravian, those who scattered in panic and lived to spawn new generations, carried that terror with them in their genetic code. And every Ork that has emerged from their spores since that day carries an echo of that fear, a warning written in their very biology. Beware the Golden Warriors, for they are death-walking. The psychic presence of the Emperor's Chosen. Beyond the physical might and superior technology of Custodian Dreadnoughts lies something more subtle, yet equally terrifying to Orks: the psychic and spiritual presence these machines project. To fully understand this phenomenon, we must delve into the metaphysical realities of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the material and immaterial realms constantly bleed into one another, and where will and belief can shape reality as surely as any physical force. The Custodian within the Dreadnought isn't simply a skilled warrior operating advanced machinery. Each Custodian is a living masterwork of genetic engineering, created using techniques that combine the Emperor's understanding of both material science and warpcraft. The Emperor didn't just enhance the Custodians' physical capabilities, he crafted their very souls, shaping them at a level that goes beyond what even the most sophisticated gene manipulation could achieve through purely material means. Each Custodian possesses a psychic signature, a presence in the warp that reflects their absolute dedication to their duty and their unshakable loyalty to the master of mankind. This psychic signature doesn't make Custodians psychers in the conventional sense. They don't hurl lightning bolts or peer into the future, or perform any of the overt displays of power associated with sanctioned psychers or librarians. Instead, their psychic presence manifests as an aura, a field of absolute certainty and unwavering purpose that affects everyone around them, enemy and ally alike. Those who fight alongside Custodians report feeling inspired, emboldened, filled with a courage that transcends their normal capabilities. Those who stand against them feel the opposite, a creeping sense of doom, a certainty that they face something beyond mortal comprehension. When a Custodian is interred within a Dreadnought, this psychic presence doesn't diminish. If anything, it intensifies. The Dreadnought chassis itself crafted with the Emperor's blessing and incorporating components worked by his own hands, acts as a conduit and amplifier for the Custodian's essence. The machine becomes not just a weapon platform, but a reliquary, a sacred vessel that houses a living saint of the Imperial cult, though the Custodians themselves would never accept such a designation. The effect this has on the battlefield is profound and multifaceted. Imperial forces fighting alongside a Custodian dreadnought find their courage steeled, their aim steadier, their resolve unbreakable. Space Marines, already superhuman in their dedication and fearlessness, fight with even greater zeal when a golden dreadnought advances in their battle line. Imperial Guard soldiers, ordinary humans facing horrors beyond imagination, hold their ground against odds that would normally break them, drawing strength from the presence of the Emperor's chosen warrior. But for Orks, the effect is precisely inverted, and it strikes at the very foundation of what makes them dangerous. The Warg field that sustains Ork morale and makes their technology function operates on collective belief and enthusiasm. Orks fight well because fighting makes them happy, and their happiness generates psychic energy that reinforces their effectiveness. It's a positive feedback loop. Successful combat generates WAG energy, which makes them fight better, which leads to more success, which generates more energy. The psychic presence of a Custodian dreadnought disrupts this loop at every level. The absolute certainty radiating from the entombed warrior creates what some inquisitors have termed a null zone in the WAG field, not in the sense of blanking psychic powers like a pariah would, but rather in creating an area where Ork collective belief cannot gain purchase. The enthusiasm and joy that normally drives Ork combat effectiveness crashes against this wall of inhuman perfection and dissipates like foam on a rocky shore. Consider what this means for an individual Ork. Their entire existence is predicated on the belief that they can overcome any obstacle through strength and numbers, that every fight is an opportunity for glory, that death in battle is the highest honor they can achieve. These aren't just cultural values, they're psychic truths reinforced by the WAG field every moment of every day. An Ork knows they're tough because the WAG field confirms it. They know they can win because their fellows believe it, and that belief becomes reality. Then they encounter a Custodian dreadnought, and all of those certainties crumble. The psychic presence of the entombed warrior doesn't just overpower the WAG field, it actively contradicts it. Where the WAG screams that might makes right and the biggest fighter wins, the Custodian's presence whispers a different truth. Perfection trumps strength, skill surpasses numbers, and purpose outweighs passion. And because this message comes from a being whose psychic signature carries the authority of the Emperor himself, it cuts through the WAG field like a knife through parchment. This isn't a conscious process. The Orks don't suddenly have philosophical revelations about the nature of combat or receive telepathic messages telling them they're doomed. Instead, they simply find that their usual sources of courage and confidence have abandoned them. The psychic feedback that normally tells them they're unstoppable suddenly goes quiet. The certainty that more Daka will solve any problem evaporates. The joy of combat turns to ash in their mouths, replaced by a creeping sense that they face something fundamentally wrong, something that shouldn't exist according to the laws of Ork reality. The effect becomes even more pronounced when multiple Orks are present, because the WAG field is a collective phenomenon. When one Ork's confidence falters, it affects those around them. When an entire mob suddenly finds their psychic support structure undermined by the presence of a Custodian dreadnought, the collapse can cascade through the entire formation in seconds. Orks who would normally charge forward with reckless abandon find themselves hesitating, looking to their fellows for reassurance, and finding the same doubt reflected in every pair of red eyes. Ork weird boys, the psychically sensitive greenskins who channel WAG energy into devastating attacks, find themselves particularly afflicted by the presence of Custodian dreadnoughts. These unfortunate Orks are already barely in control of the energies that flow through them, constantly on the edge of their heads, exploding from psychic overload. The introduction of a powerful counter-frequency to the wah field, in the form of a custodian's absolute certainty and purpose, can create catastrophic dissonance in a weirdboy's mind. There are recorded instances of weirdboys suffering psychic backlash when custodian dreadnoughts entered the battlefield, their heads literally exploding as the conflicting psychic energies tore them apart from within. In other cases, weirdboys have simply fallen catatonic, overwhelmed by the dissonance between the familiar wag energy and this new, incomprehensible force. Either way, the loss of these psychic conductors further destabilizes the Ork formation, creating a void in their psychic infrastructure that accelerates the collapse of morale. The religious or spiritual aspect of this phenomenon cannot be overlooked. While custodians don't worship the Emperor as a god, they embody his will more completely than perhaps any other servants of the Imperium. They were created by his own hands, crafted to be living extensions of his purpose, shaped to serve as the ultimate guardians of his vision for humanity. This connection to the master of mankind isn't merely symbolic or cultural, it's woven into their very being at a level that transcends the material. When a custodian is entombed in a dreadnought, this connection doesn't weaken. The dreadnought itself becomes a shrine, a mobile temple to the Emperor's vision and power. The armor plates worked by his hands serve as relics of the highest order, imbued with a sanctity that goes beyond mere craftsmanship. The weapons it carries have been blessed not just by tech priests and chaplains, but by the direct touch of humanity's greatest leader and most powerful psyker. Every component, every system, every inch of auramite plating carries an echo of his will. For beings attuned to the warp, this makes custodian dreadnoughts terrifying in a way that conventional weapons cannot match. Chaos worshippers report feeling physically ill in the presence of these machines, as if their very existence is an affront to the dark gods they serve. Demons find themselves weakened, their grip on reality loosened by the sheer concentration of the Emperor's essence that radiates from these golden war machines. The warp itself seems to recoil from custodian dreadnoughts, creating localized areas where the immaterial realm's influence is suppressed. Orks, being a psychically active species whose entire civilization operates through collective belief and warp manipulation, are particularly vulnerable to this spiritual weight. Even though they're not chaos-tainted in the conventional sense, even though they worship their own gods Gork and Mork rather than the ruinous powers, they still operate through similar mechanisms of belief and psychic reality. When that psychic reality encounters something that embodies the Emperor's will so completely, so utterly, the conflict between these forces creates a rupture in the wah field that can shatter entire formations. There's also the factor of the custodian's own mental state and how it affects the machine's presence. Unlike space marines, who may struggle with the psychological trauma of being entombed in a dreadnought, custodians accept this transformation with the same calm certainty they bring to every aspect of their service. There's no rage, no resentment, no desperate clinging to their former existence. They simply continue their duty in a new form, and this absolute acceptance creates a psychic profile of perfect order and purpose. This ordered, controlled mental state creates a sharp contrast with the chaotic, emotion-driven psychic signature of Ork wag energy, where the wag is turbulent and ever-changing, fed by the excitement and aggression of thousands of Orks. The custodian dreadnought's presence is still and unwavering, like a pillar of adamantium thrust through the heart of a raging river. The wag energy cannot flow around it, cannot incorporate it, cannot understand it. It can only crash against this immovable obstacle and break apart. Imagine being an Ork psyker, constantly buffeted by the psychic emanations of your fellow greenskins, channeling their collective aggression into devastating warp lightning. You've learned to ride this chaotic energy, to shape it into weapons that can tear reality apart. Then a Custodian Dreadnought arrives, and suddenly there's a dead spot in your psychic awareness, a void where the familiar turbulence of the "Wah" simply stops. You try to channel energy toward this target, try to bring the full psychic might of your mob to bear, and it's like throwing water at a mountain. The energy doesn't hit and splash, it doesn't damage or affect, it simply stops, disappears, ceases to exist. This is the psychic reality of facing a Custodian Dreadnought as an Ork, and it's a reality that undermines everything they believe about how the universe works. It creates a cognitive dissonance so profound that it can literally cause physical damage to psychically sensitive Orks, and psychologically break even those who aren't directly touched by warp energies. Breaking the Wah energy. The complete and catastrophic collapse of Ork morale in the presence of Custodian Dreadnoughts represents one of the most significant tactical advantages these war machines possess. Yet it's also one of the least understood by those who haven't witnessed it firsthand. To comprehend how thoroughly a Custodian Dreadnought can shatter the WAG energy that sustains greenskin forces, we must examine the mechanisms of this collapse and the cascading failures it triggers throughout Ork battle lines. The WAG energy that binds Ork forces together operates as a distributed network, with every greenskin contributing to and drawing from a collective pool of psychic power. This isn't a centralized system with clear points of failure, unlike, say, a Space Marine command structure where killing the captain can disrupt the entire company. Instead, it's more like a vast web where each node reinforces every other node, creating redundancy and resilience that makes Ork armies remarkably difficult to break through conventional means. A war boss serves as the primary focus of this energy, the biggest and strongest node in the network, but they're not the only source. The excitement of battle itself generates WAG energy. The presence of other Orks reinforces it. Even the belief in Gork and Mork, the savage Ork gods, feeds into this psychic ecosystem. This distributed nature is why Ork armies can often continue fighting effectively even after losing their leaders, why scattered mobs will still charge forward with enthusiasm, why greenskin forces sometimes seem impossible to fully defeat. Custodian Dreadnoughts attack this system at multiple levels simultaneously, creating a cascade of failures that ripples through the entire Ork force. The process begins the moment these golden war machines enter the battlefield, before they've fired a single shot or struck a single blow. Their mere presence creates what military analysts might call a morale event horizon, a sphere of influence where the normal laws of Ork psychology cease to function as expected. At the most basic level, the physical superiority of the Custodian Dreadnought contradicts the fundamental Ork belief that bigger equals stronger and more equals better. When Orks see their shots bounce harmlessly off Auramite armor, when they watch their biggest knobs get casually swatted aside by power fists, when they witness mobs of hundreds reduced to scattered corpses in seconds, the psychic feedback they receive challenges their most basic assumptions about combat. The whack field, which normally reinforces their belief that they can overcome any obstacle, suddenly starts sending conflicting signals. This creates the first crack in the network. Individual Orks begin to doubt, not consciously or rationally, but at that deep psychic level where the wah energy operates. These doubts become noise in the network, static that interferes with the normally clear signal of collective aggression and enthusiasm. As more Orks witness the Dreadnought's effectiveness, as more greenskins experience the crushing realization that their usual tactics aren't working, this static grows louder. The death of Ork leaders, while significant, takes on additional weight in the presence of a Custodian Dreadnought. When a nob or war boss falls in normal combat, other Orks might see it as an opportunity to prove themselves, to take the fallen leader's place, and show their even ardor. But when a leader is obliterated by a Custodian Dreadnought, reduced to paste, or bisected with such casual efficiency that there's barely time to register what happened. The message sent through the WAG field is different. It's not "the boss was weak," it's "nothing can stand against this enemy." This distinction is crucial. The first message would trigger competition and potentially even strengthen the WAG as ambitious orcs vie for dominance. The second message triggers existential dread, a recognition that the normal orc hierarchy of strength doesn't apply when facing these golden giants. When a war boss who could crump any challenger, who had proven their strength through countless victories, gets annihilated without even slowing down the Custodian Dreadnought, what hope do lesser orcs have? The speed at which Custodian Dreadnoughts eliminate enemies contributes significantly to this psychological collapse. Orcs expect combat to be a process, a back-and-forth exchange where both sides trade blows, and the tougher fighter eventually wins. Even against superior enemies like Space Marines, there's usually some sense of mutual engagement, of both parties participating in the fight. Custodian Dreadnoughts don't fight in this way. They execute. The time between an orc becoming a target and that orc ceasing to exist can be measured in fractions of a second. This speed denies the WAG field the time it needs to process and respond to threats. Normally, when orcs face a powerful enemy, the collective psychic energy can adapt, channeling additional aggression toward the threat, bolstering the courage of those engaging it, creating a feedback loop that sustains morale even in difficult circumstances. But when threats are eliminated faster than the WAG field can register them, when orcs are dying so quickly that their fellows don't have time to process what's happening, the field becomes confused, overwhelmed with conflicting signals that it cannot synthesize into coherent responses. The weapons employed by Custodian Dreadnoughts amplify this effect through sheer horror. When an orc gets killed by a bolter round or a chainsword, other orcs understand what happened. They've seen those weapons before, know how they work, can incorporate them into their understanding of combat. But when a mob of orcs gets reduced to their component atoms by an Iliastus accelerator culverin, when they watch their fellows simply cease to exist in a burst of energy that defies explanation, the WAG field receives input it literally cannot process. Remember, orcs aren't just affected by what they see, but by what they psychically sense through the WAG field. When another orc dies nearby, the surviving greenskins feel that death as a momentary disruption in the network, a node going dark. Normally, this just adds to the excitement of battle, confirms that there's a proper fight happening. But when dozens or hundreds of nodes start going dark in rapid succession, when the psychic landscape suddenly has voids appearing faster than the field can compensate, it creates a sensation of overwhelming loss that even the dimmest orc can perceive. The Contemptor Galatus pattern, with its massive Presidium shield and defensive capabilities, creates a particular form of psychological warfare. Orcs can understand an enemy that kills them quickly. That's just a good fight against a worthy opponent. What they struggle with is an enemy they cannot harm, no matter what they do. When a Galatus dreadnought advances through a firestorm of orc fire, its shield blazing as it absorbs shots that would level buildings, and emerges completely unscathed to butcher the shooters with its Galatus warblade, the message sent through the WAG field is one of absolute futility. This futility is poisonous to orc psychology in a way few other emotions can match. Orcs can handle being outfought, because that means they need to get ardor and try again. They can handle being outnumbered, because they pride themselves on facing long odds. They can even handle dying, because death in battle is glorious. But facing an enemy they cannot hurt, cannot slow down, cannot even annoy. That breaks something fundamental in their psyche. The cascade effect this creates in the WAG field is devastating. As more orcs experience this futility, as more nodes in the network start broadcasting signals of fear and confusion rather than aggression and enthusiasm, the collective psychic energy begins to destabilize. The feedback loops that normally sustain orc morale start working in reverse, creating what military psychologists might call a death spiral. Each orc's failing confidence affects those around them, which further reduces confidence, which affects even more orcs, and so on. Weird boys, those unfortunate orcs who channel WAG energy directly, become liability rather than assets in this scenario. Normally, they can convert excess WAG energy into devastating psychic attacks, serving as release valves for the collective psychic pressure. But when that energy becomes contaminated with fear and doubt, when the clear signal of orcish aggression becomes static-filled and confused, weird boys have nothing useful to channel. They either explode from the psychic strain of processing these conflicting signals, or they collapse into catatonia, unable to function in an environment where the WAG field has become incomprehensible. The loss of weird boys accelerates the collapse because they're not just psychers, they're psychic infrastructure. They help maintain and channel the WAG field, acting as nodes with more capacity than ordinary orcs. When these critical nodes fail, it's like losing power substations in an electrical grid. The remaining network has to handle increased load, which increases stress, which leads to more failures until the entire system crashes. Orc vehicles and technology become unreliable as the WAG field destabilizes. Remember, Orc technology works partially through collective belief mediated by the psychic field. When that field is strong and confident, their ramshackle vehicles run flawlessly. Their crude guns shoot straight and true. Even their most absurd contraptions function exactly as their creators intended. But when the field weakens, when doubt creeps into the collective orc consciousness, the technology begins to fail. Guns jam at critical moments. Vehicles stall or explode. Ramshackle armor plating that was holding together through pure orcish belief suddenly remembers it's just scrap metal welded haphazardly together and falls apart. These mechanical failures further reduce orc effectiveness, which deepens their fear and doubt, which further destabilizes the WAG field, which causes more mechanical failures. It's another feedback loop, another cascade of failures feeding into the overall collapse. The spatial aspect of this phenomenon is particularly interesting. The effect of a Custodian Dreadnought on the WAG field isn't uniform across the entire orc force. It's strongest near the Dreadnought itself, creating a sphere of morale suppression that expands as the machine advances. Orcs, at the edge of this sphere, might still feel brave and eager for combat, at least until they see their fellows closer to the Dreadnought, fleeing in panic or dying in droves. Then they too enter the suppression sphere, and their confidence evaporates. This creates visible ripples in the orc battle line, waves of faltering morale that propagate outward from the Custodian Dreadnought's position. Observant Imperial commanders have learned to recognize these patterns and exploit them, using the Dreadnought as a wedge to split orc formations or as an anvil against which other Imperial forces can hammer the enemy. The recovery of WAH energy after a Custodian Dreadnought engagement is notably slow compared to other defeats. Normally, surviving orcs can rebuild their confidence relatively quickly, gathering together and feeding off each other's enthusiasm until the WAH field restores itself. But the deep psychic wounds inflicted by encountering these golden war machines seem to linger, creating what some inquisitors have described as psychic scar tissue in the collective orc consciousness. Orcs who survive encounters with Custodian Dreadnoughts carry the memory of that terror with them, and when they spawn new orcs through their fungal reproduction, some echo of that fear may transfer to the next generation. This creates a compounding effect over time, where areas that have seen multiple engagements with Custodian forces develop orc populations that are noticeably more hesitant when facing golden armored warriors, even those who have never personally encountered them before. Perhaps most tellingly, orc looting behavior changes in the presence of Custodian Dreadnoughts. Normally, orcs are enthusiastic scavengers who will steal anything not nailed down, and several things that are. They see defeated enemies as sources of valuable gubbins, and are often more interested in looting the battlefield than in completely annihilating their foes. But after engagements with Custodian Dreadnoughts, surviving Orks often abandon the battlefield entirely, leaving behind even valuable salvage in their haste to escape. The usual excitement about looting the good bits is overridden by a more primal urge to simply get away from these golden nightmares. This represents perhaps the clearest indicator that something fundamental has broken in the Ork psyche. When a species that lives for combat and values looting above almost all else abandons both the fight and the spoils, when they flee despite having numerical superiority, when they scatter in disarray despite every genetic and cultural imperative telling them to stand and fight, you know you've witnessed something extraordinary. The Wah energy that sustains Ork civilization across the galaxy, that makes them one of the most persistent and dangerous threats in the 41st millennium, that has allowed them to survive and thrive for millions of years, encounters in Custodian Dreadnoughts something it cannot overcome, cannot adapt to, cannot incorporate into its understanding of reality. And when that energy breaks, when that psychic network crashes, the Orks are revealed for what they are beneath all their bluster and aggression. A species facing something far beyond their ability to comprehend or defeat. Historical encounters. Through the millennia, the terror that Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire in Ork forces isn't based solely on ancient legend or theoretical analysis. Throughout the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy, there have been numerous documented encounters between these golden war machines and greenskin hordes, each reinforcing and expanding upon the lessons first taught at WH40K. These engagements, scattered across time and space, paint a consistent picture of Ork forces being systematically dismantled by a foe they cannot overcome. The War of the Beast, which erupted in the mid-32nd millennium, stands as one of the most significant Ork threats in Imperial history and provides our first major post-heresy account of Custodian forces engaging a massive WAG. This wasn't simply a large greenskin incursion. It was an existential threat to the Imperium itself, led by a mysterious war boss known only as the Beast, whose WAG actually reached terror itself, something no Ork force had achieved before or has achieved since. The Beast's Orks were different from their modern counterparts in disturbing ways. They were larger, more organized, more technologically sophisticated. Standard Ork boys stood as tall as Space Marine Terminators, while their knobs towered even higher. They employed tactics that demonstrated strategic thinking beyond what greenskins normally display, coordinating their forces across multiple star systems and adapting to Imperial countermeasures with alarming speed. This was a WAG that threatened to overwhelm the Imperium through sheer size and sophistication. When the Beast's forces reached terror, they encountered the Adeptus Custodes, defending their eternal vigil over the Imperial Palace. Though detailed records of these engagements are classified at the highest levels, what has emerged through various sources paints a picture of desperate fighting where even the Custodians were pressed hard. The Golden Warriors held their ground, as they always do, but the sheer scale of the Ork assault was unprecedented. This was not a standard greenskin mob, but a perfectly coordinated military machine guided by an intelligence that seemed almost un-Orkish in its cunning. What broke the Ork assault on Terra wasn't simply the Custodians' skill, though that certainly played a major role. It was the systematic destruction of the Beast's leadership and elite forces, carried out with the cold precision that only the Emperor's guardians could muster. When Custodian forces engaged the Beast's nobs and warbosses directly, even these enhanced greenskins, larger and tougher than any Orks seen before or since, fell before the Golden Warriors with a consistency that must have been psychologically devastating to the ordinary boys witnessing it. The records mention Custodian Dreadnoughts deployed during the later stages of the War of the Beast, when Imperial forces finally went on the offensive against the Ork Empire that had been established. These ancient war machines, awakened from their long slumber to face this extraordinary threat, carved through Ork positions with the same overwhelming efficiency their predecessors had demonstrated at WH40K. The enhanced Orks, for all their increased size and sophistication, proved no more capable of stopping these golden juggernauts than their smaller ancestors had been. One particularly detailed account, preserved in the archives of the Inquisition, describes a Telemon-heavy dreadnought engaging Ork forces on one of the beast's primary worlds. The report notes that despite facing Ork boys who stood as tall as the dreadnought's waist and knobs who could match it in height, the Telemon advanced through their ranks without slowing, its weapons reducing entire mobs to scattered atoms. The psychological impact was profound. Even these genetically enhanced greenskins, products of whatever strange process had made the beast's Orks so formidable, broke and fled when confronted with this golden nightmare. Moving forward in history, the Third War for Armageddon in the late 41st millennium provides more recent examples of Custodian forces engaging Orks, though their involvement in this conflict remained largely classified until recently revealed sources came to light. Warlord Ghazghkull Thraka, arguably the most dangerous Ork leader since the beast himself, had assembled a WAG of unprecedented size and was threatening to overwhelm the critical hive world of Armageddon. The deployment of Custodian forces to Armageddon was limited, a handful of warriors compared to the millions of combatants on both sides, yet their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. Records from Imperial commanders describe how Ork advances would falter when golden armored warriors appeared on the battlefield, how WAG that had been unstoppable would suddenly lose momentum when Custodians engaged them directly. Of particular note is an engagement in the hive city of Acheron, where a single Contemptor Achilles dreadnought held a critical transit hub against an Ork assault force that numbered in the tens of thousands. For 3 days and nights, this lone war machine defended the position, its Achilles dreadspear reaping a terrible toll on the greenskin hordes. The Orks, despite having overwhelming numerical superiority, could not dislodge this single defender. Waves of boys broke against its position like water against stone, each assault leaving nothing but bodies and wreckage. What makes this engagement particularly significant is the documented change in Ork behavior over the course of the battle. The first assaults were conducted with typical greenskin enthusiasm, mobs charging forward with war cries and blazing guns, confident in their ability to overwhelm any enemy through sheer numbers. But as the hours wore on and the casualties mounted, as mob after mob was shattered against this immovable golden barrier, the Ork attacks became noticeably less enthusiastic. War cries grew quieter, charges less coordinated, the typical Orkish joy of combat replaced by something approaching reluctance. By the third day, Ork war bosses were having to physically beat their boys to get them to attack, a behavior rarely seen among greenskins. The WAG energy that should have been at its peak during such sustained combat had instead collapsed, broken against the unchanging presence of a single Custodian dreadnought that refused to yield, refused to tire, refused to acknowledge the Orks as anything more than targets to be eliminated. The engagement ended when Imperial reinforcements arrived and broke the Ork siege. But the Custodian dreadnought was still fully operational, its weapons still functional, having expended less than half its ammunition despite 3 days of continuous combat. The Ork dead numbered well over 15,000, all killed by a single war machine. The exchange ratio was even more extreme than Gyros Thravian, and the psychological impact on the surviving Orks was profound enough that this particular mob never fully recovered its effectiveness. More recent engagements, as the Imperium enters its current dark age with the opening of the Great Rift, have seen increased deployment of Custodian forces across the galaxy. The Indomitus Crusade, launched to stabilize the Imperium in the wake of this catastrophe, included Custodian contingents, and wherever these golden warriors appeared, Ork forces found themselves facing a foe that shattered not just their battle lines, but their very will to fight. Reports from Crusade commanders consistently note the same patterns. Ork WAG that had rolled over Imperial Guard regiments and even Space Marine forces with relative ease would stall completely when Custodians entered the battle. War bosses who had proven their cunning and strength through countless victories would make uncharacteristic tactical errors in the presence of golden armored warriors. Ork technology, usually reliable, despite its ramshackle appearance, would fail at critical moments when facing Custodian forces. A particularly telling incident occurred during the liberation of the Forge World Metallica, where Ork forces had established a significant foothold. A Contemptor Galatas dreadnought was deployed to break through Ork fortifications, protecting a critical manufacturing complex. The Greenskins had prepared extensive defenses, gun emplacements, force fields, hundreds of boys ready to repel any assault. The Galatas simply walked through them. Its Praesidium shield absorbed the initial barrage of fire without so much as flickering, the defensive field so robust that the Ork guns might as well have been shooting at the void for all the effect they had. As it advanced, the Dreadnought's Galatas warblade carved through force field generators and fortifications with equal ease, its twin-linked Infernus incinerators, purging defensive positions in gouts of sanctified flame. Within minutes, fortifications that should have required hours of artillery bombardment to reduce were nothing but smoking ruins. The Orks, watching their carefully prepared defenses simply cease to matter, broke completely. They didn't retreat in good order or fall back to secondary positions. They scattered in panic, abandoning weapons and equipment in their desperate flight. Subsequent interrogation of captured Greenskins revealed a consistent theme. They described the Galatas not as a war machine or enemy soldier, but as a bad omen, a wrong thing, something that shouldn't exist and whose presence violated the natural order of combat. These modern encounters reinforce the lessons of history while adding new dimensions to our understanding of how Custodian dreadnoughts affect Ork psychology. It's not simply that these war machines kill efficiently. It's that they break something fundamental in the Ork understanding of combat. They represent an enemy type that Ork genetic memory and cultural programming aren't equipped to handle, a threat that cannot be overcome through the usual greenskin solutions of more Daka and more boys. One particularly interesting observation comes from Ordo Xenos Inquisitors, who have studied Ork behavior across multiple engagements with Custodian forces. They note that Ork territories that have experienced encounters with Custodian dreadnoughts show decreased "wah" activity for years afterward. It's as if the mere memory of these golden war machines suppresses the natural Ork tendency toward aggressive expansion, creating what one inquisitor described as psychic cold spots in the normally turbulent map of greenskin activity. This effect seems to persist even across Ork generations. Territories infested with Orks descended from survivors of Custodian engagements demonstrate noticeably different behavior when facing golden-armored warriors. Where Orks with no prior exposure to Custodians will charge forward with typical enthusiasm, at least initially, those with genetic memory of previous defeats show immediate hesitation, as if some deep instinct is warning them away from this particular threat. The historical record also reveals attempts by particularly canny Ork war bosses to avoid engaging Custodian forces directly. There are documented instances of "wah's" changing course when intelligence reached them about Custodian deployments in their path. This behavior is almost unprecedented among Greenskins, who normally relish the challenge of facing powerful enemies and would ordinarily see reports of especially strong foes as an invitation rather than a deterrent. One such case involved Warboss Nazdreg, a Blood Axe leader known for his tactical cunning. When informed that Custodian forces were defending a particular sector he had planned to raid, Nazdreg diverted his to different targets, explaining to his puzzled subordinates that "dem golden gits ain't worth the bother." This from a war boss who had previously sought out challenges, who had deliberately targeted Space Marine fortress monasteries for the prestige of defeating the Emperor's finest warriors. Yet when faced with the prospect of fighting Custodians, he chose discretion over valor. These historical patterns, spanning from the Great Crusade through the current dire age, paint a consistent picture. Custodian dreadnoughts don't just defeat Ork forces, they traumatize them, creating lasting psychological damage that persists across time and even across generations of greenskins. Each engagement reinforces the terror imprinted in Ork genetic memory at Gyros Thravian, adding new layers of fear and confirming that these golden nightmares are indeed as unstoppable as instinct warns. For the Orks, who measure time not in precise years, but in the rhythm of endless combat, who remember history through genetic inheritance rather than written records, the lesson is clear and consistent. Fight anyone, fight anything, but when the golden giants appear, when those towering war machines emerge from the smoke and fire, even the bravest Ork knows that this is not a fight they can win, not a scrap they can enjoy, not an enemy they can overcome. The fear is real, it's deep, and it's justified. The warrior within the machine. To truly understand why Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire such profound terror in Orks, we must look beyond the physical chassis and advanced weaponry to consider the consciousness housed within that golden shell. Each Custodian Dreadnought contains not merely a skilled warrior, but a living legend, a warrior whose martial prowess was exceptional even by the impossibly high standards of the Adeptus Custodes. These are individuals who had already achieved near perfection in their original bodies, and their interment in a dreadnought doesn't diminish their capabilities. In many ways, it amplifies them. The process of becoming a Custodian Dreadnought is fundamentally different from the equivalent journey for a Space Marine. When a Space Marine is catastrophically wounded and chosen for Dreadnought interment, it's often a desperate measure, a last attempt to preserve a valuable warrior when their original body has been damaged beyond the ability of even advanced Imperial medicine to repair. The process is traumatic, psychologically devastating, and many Space Marines struggle with the transition from flesh to metal, raging against their new existence or falling into deep melancholy. Custodians approach this transition with characteristic calm and purpose. For them, interment isn't a tragedy or a punishment. It's simply a new form of service. The absolute dedication to duty that defines every custodian doesn't waver when their body fails. They accept the dreadnought chassis as they would accept any other assignment, viewing it as merely another tool with which to fulfill their eternal mission of protecting the Emperor and his realm. This psychological stability creates a warrior whose effectiveness is not compromised by internal conflict or resentment. Consider what it means to place a custodian's mind, with all its accumulated skill and experience, into a war machine equipped with weapons that can level buildings and armor that can withstand bombardment. A baseline custodian, fighting on foot in their guardian armor, is already capable of defeating dozens of enemies single-handedly. They move with a grace that seems impossible for being so large, anticipate enemy actions with almost prescient accuracy, and demonstrate mastery of weapons arts that have been honed over centuries of constant training and combat. Now amplify that skill with the power of a dreadnought chassis. The Custodian's enhanced reflexes, already superhuman, are paired with sensors that can track targets across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Their tactical genius, developed through centuries of warfare, now has access to computational aids that can process battlefield data faster than any biological brain. Their already formidable strength is multiplied by servo motors and power systems that can tear through reinforced bunkers. The result is not simply addition, but multiplication of capabilities. The centuries or even millennia of experience that a custodian brings to their dreadnought sarcophagus represents something truly extraordinary. Unlike Space Marines, who are recruited in adolescence and may serve for a few centuries at most, custodians can serve for thousands of years before their body suffers the kind of catastrophic damage that requires dreadnought interment. By the time a custodian reaches this point, they have accumulated knowledge and combat experience that makes even the most veteran Space Marine seem like a novice. These warriors have fought against every enemy the Imperium has ever faced. They've battled Orks across countless worlds, studied their tactics, learned their patterns, understood their psychology, in ways that go beyond mere academic knowledge. When a Custodian dreadnought engages greenskin forces, they're not improvising or relying on generalized training. They're drawing on specific, detailed knowledge accumulated over centuries of fighting these particular enemies. They know how orcs think, how they move, how they react to different stimuli. They can predict greenskin behavior with uncanny accuracy because they've seen it all before, multiple times, in countless variations. This level of expertise manifests in ways that are subtle but devastating. A Space Marine dreadnought might charge into an orc mob and start swinging, relying on superior strength and armor to carry the day. A Custodian dreadnought, even one newly interred with only a few centuries of combat experience, will instead identify the orc knob leading the mob, eliminate them with surgical precision, recognize the precise moment when the mob's morale begins to waver, and press the attack at exactly that psychological breaking point to trigger a complete rout. This tactical sophistication is something orcs simply cannot counter. Their own combat style, based on enthusiastic aggression and overwhelming numbers, has no answer for an enemy who can read the battlefield like a book written in their own blood, who can anticipate their moves before they make them, who possesses the experience of thousands of battles distilled into pure combat instinct. It's like a master chess player facing someone who's just learned how the pieces move. The outcome is never in doubt, only the speed of the inevitable defeat. The psychological impact of this disparity becomes evident when we consider how orcs perceive combat. They understand strength, they understand toughness, they even understand speed to some degree. What they struggle to comprehend is skill at this level. Expertise so refined that it transcends mere physical capability and becomes something approaching art. When an orc fights a Space Marine, they can at least understand what's happening, even if they're losing. They can see the enemy's moves, recognize the techniques being employed, learn from the experience, even as they die. But fighting a Custodian dreadnought, piloted by a warrior with millennia of combat experience, the orcs can't even process what's happening to them. They swing and miss, they shoot and fail to hit, they charge and find themselves outmaneuvered before they've even closed the distance. The battle isn't just one-sided, it's incomprehensible. The Custodian is operating on a level of tactical and strategic understanding so far beyond orc capability that the greenskins might as well be fighting a force of nature for all the ability they have to predict or counter its actions. This creates a particular form of psychological terror that goes beyond simple fear of death. Orcs can accept being killed by a stronger enemy. That's just how the world works, and there's no shame in it. But being completely outclassed, being so thoroughly dominated that you can't even land a single effective blow, that you can't force your enemy to acknowledge you as a threat worthy of their full attention. That's humiliating in a way that strikes at the core of orc identity. The communication between Custodian dreadnoughts and their battle brothers demonstrates another aspect of their superiority. Unlike some Space Marine dreadnoughts who become isolated in their sarcophagi, cut off from their chapters, except when awakened for battle, Custodian dreadnoughts remain fully integrated into their organizations. They serve as advisors, their centuries of experience making them invaluable sources of tactical and strategic wisdom. They participate in planning sessions, their analytical capabilities enhanced by their dreadnoughts' computational systems, while their judgment remains purely their own. This active mental engagement keeps their minds sharp in a way that benefits them greatly in combat. There's no period of disorientation when they're awakened for battle. No need to reacquaint themselves with current tactical doctrine or modern enemies. They've been tracking these developments all along, studying battle reports, analyzing enemy patterns, maintaining their edge even during periods when they're not actively deployed. When they do enter combat, they do so with perfect awareness of the current situation, ready to apply their accumulated knowledge to the specific challenges at hand. For orcs facing such a warrior, the implications are dire. They're not just fighting an ancient war machine. They're fighting someone who knows more about killing orcs than any war boss knows about leading them. Every strength the greenskins possess, every tactic they might employ, every psychological tendency that drives their behavior, the Custodian Dreadnought has catalogued it all, has encountered it countless times, has developed specific countermeasures refined over centuries of application. The individual combat prowess of the Custodian within the Dreadnought also manifests in ways that seem almost supernatural to observers. There are accounts of Custodian Dreadnoughts dodging shots that should have been impossible to avoid, the pilot's enhanced reflexes and experience allowing them to read the trajectory of incoming fire and adjust their massive chassis just enough to make the shot miss. There are reports of these war machines executing combat maneuvers that defy what observers believe a dreadnought should be capable of, moving with a fluidity and precision that suggests the pilot has so thoroughly mastered their mechanical body that it responds to their will as naturally as their original flesh did. This mastery comes from a combination of factors: the superior neural interfaces that connect Custodian to chassis, the advanced training Custodians receive before interment, the centuries or millennia of combat experience that allow them to intuitively understand how to leverage their mechanical body's capabilities. All of these elements combine to create a pilot who is not merely operating a war machine, but who has become one with it in a way that transcends the crude mind-machine interfaces used in lesser dreadnoughts. When an Ork witnesses a Custodian dreadnought moving with this kind of grace and precision, when they see this massive war machine dodge and weave through combat like a dancer rather than lumbering forward like a tank, it creates a cognitive dissonance that their psyche struggles to process. Dreadnoughts aren't supposed to move like that. War machines of that size and weight should be slow, predictable, vulnerable to faster enemies who can outmaneuver them. But Custodian dreadnoughts violate these expectations, demonstrating capabilities that seem to break the rules of how combat should work. Perhaps most unsettling for Orks is the sense they get when facing a Custodian dreadnought that they're being judged and found wanting. The Custodian within isn't fighting with anger or hatred or any emotion the Orks can recognize and respond to. They're simply executing their duty with the same calm precision they bring to every aspect of their service. To them, the Orks aren't enemies in the sense of rivals or threats. They're targets to be eliminated, problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted effort. This emotional detachment, this sense that the Custodian views the entire Ork mob as beneath their notice, as barely worthy of the effort required to destroy them, is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the encounter. Orks want their enemies to acknowledge them, to recognize them as worthy opponents, to engage with them on some level of mutual combat. The Custodian dreadnought offers no such recognition. It simply processes targets, eliminates threats, and moves on, as unmoved by the death of 1,000 Orks, as a farmer would be by harvesting a field of grain. This is what truly breaks the Ork spirit when facing these golden nightmares. Not just that they're powerful, not just that they're skilled, not just that they're nearly impossible to kill. It's that they represent perfection in a form that Orks can never aspire to, mastery of combat arts refined over timescales that dwarf Ork lifespans, dedication to purpose so complete that it allows no room for the chaos and enthusiasm that defines greenskin existence. The warrior within the machine is what transforms a Custodian dreadnought from merely a superior war machine into an avatar of unstoppable force, an enemy that Orks fear not just because of what it can do, but because of what it represents, the ultimate expression of disciplined violence, perfection made manifest in golden auramite, a living reminder that there are forces in the galaxy so far beyond Ork capabilities that attempting to fight them is not bravery, but futility. Tactical implications on the battlefield. The deployment of Custodian dreadnoughts against Ork forces carries implications that extend far beyond the immediate combat zone. Understanding how these golden war machines affect the broader tactical and strategic situation provides crucial insight into why they inspire such terror and why their mere presence can alter the course of entire campaigns. When Imperial commanders have access to Custodian Dreadnoughts, they gain what military analysts term a force multiplier that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The most obvious effect is direct combat effectiveness. A single Custodian Dreadnought can accomplish objectives that would normally require entire companies of Space Marines or regiments of Imperial Guard. But the secondary effects, the ways in which these war machines influence enemy behavior and friendly morale, often prove even more valuable than their direct killing power. Consider a typical Ork wag assaulting an Imperial position. The Greenskins rely on momentum, on the psychological advantage that comes from feeling unstoppable, from watching their enemies fall back before the green tide. This momentum is crucial to maintaining wag energy and keeping the various mobs working together toward a common goal. An Ork advance that's making progress, that's capturing territory and defeating enemies, naturally attracts more Orks, grows stronger, becomes harder to stop. A Custodian Dreadnought introduced into this situation doesn't just slow the Ork advance, it reverses it. The psychological shock of watching this golden war machine tear through what should have been an unstoppable mob creates a pause in Ork momentum that Imperial forces can exploit. Other Ork units, seeing their fellows broken and scattered by this terrifying enemy, begin to hesitate. The wag energy that was driving them forward starts to dissipate. War bosses who were coordinating complex assaults suddenly find their subordinates less responsive to orders. This creates opportunities for Imperial counterattacks that wouldn't exist otherwise. Space Marine forces can advance into gaps created by the Custodian Dreadnought's assault, exploiting the confusion and fear spreading through Ork lines. Imperial Guard units who were on the verge of being overrun suddenly find enemy pressure easing as Orks focus their attention on the greater threat represented by the Golden War Machine. Artillery can target Ork concentrations that would normally be too mobile or too scattered to effectively engage, because the Greenskins have clumped together in confused mobs trying to respond to the Dreadnought. The positioning of a Custodian Dreadnought becomes a critical tactical consideration. Deployed at a key choke point, it can hold against Ork numbers that would overwhelm any other single unit. Placed at the tip of an Imperial advance, it can break through Ork fortifications that would require extensive artillery preparation to reduce. Used as a mobile reserve, it can respond to Ork breakthroughs with such overwhelming force that it not only stops the advance, but often triggers a general retreat in that sector. What makes Custodian Dreadnoughts particularly valuable in anti-Ork operations is their ability to target and eliminate key leaders with surgical precision. Ork command structure, such as it is, depends heavily on individual war bosses and nobs maintaining dominance through strength and presence. Kill the right Ork at the right time, and an entire mob can collapse into infighting or confusion. Space Marine forces attempt this strategy regularly, but it's difficult to execute because you have to first reach the Ork leaders, who are usually surrounded by their toughest warriors, and then defeat them in combat, which can be challenging even for Astartes when facing a truly powerful war boss. Custodian Dreadnoughts simplify this process dramatically. They can bull their way through any amount of Ork resistance to reach their target, and once they engage the enemy leader, the outcome is never in doubt. A war boss who might give a chapter master a serious fight gets obliterated by a Custodian Dreadnought in seconds. This creates what military theorists call cascading command collapse. The war boss dies. The nobs immediately start fighting among themselves to determine who's in charge. The regular boys lose cohesion because they're not sure who to follow, and the entire formation becomes vulnerable to exploitation by other Imperial forces. In a matter of minutes, an organized Ork assault can transform into a disorganized mob, all because a Custodian Dreadnought executed a precision strike against their command structure. The psychological warfare aspect of Custodian Dreadnoughts deserves special attention. Modern warfare increasingly recognizes that defeating the enemy's will to fight can be as important as destroying their combat capability. Orks, with their dependence on WAG, energy and collective morale, are particularly vulnerable to psychological operations, though conventional methods rarely work on them because they're not afraid of death and don't care about casualties in the way other species do. Custodian dreadnoughts bypass these limitations by attacking something deeper than conscious fear. They trigger that genetic memory of Gyros Thravian, that instinctive warning that orcs can't articulate but can definitely feel. This creates a form of demoralization that spreads through orc ranks like a virus, contaminating the WAG field and reducing combat effectiveness, even for greenskins who haven't directly engaged the dreadnought yet. Imperial commanders who understand this can leverage it in creative ways, broadcasting footage of a Custodian dreadnought in action to orc-held positions, allowing orc scouts to report back about the presence of these golden war machines. Even rumors and misinformation about Custodian deployment can affect orc behavior. The mere threat of facing a Custodian dreadnought is sometimes enough to make orc forces less aggressive, more cautious, more prone to internal discord as different factions argue about whether it's worth the risk of engaging these enemies. The resource economics of deploying Custodian dreadnoughts also merit consideration. These war machines are irreplaceable relics, each one a priceless artifact that cannot be recreated with current Imperial technology. Their pilots are warriors whose value to the Imperium cannot be overstated. One might think this would make commanders reluctant to deploy such valuable assets, but the calculus works differently when facing orc threats. A single Custodian dreadnought can save thousands of Imperial Guard lives, preserve dozens of Space Marines who would otherwise fall in combat, prevent the loss of entire cities or worlds that would be overrun by WAGs. When the alternative is watching a sector fall to greenskin invasion, committing a Custodian dreadnought becomes not just justified, but strategically essential. The return on investment, measured in lives saved and territory preserved, far exceeds the risk to even such a valuable asset. The coordination between Custodian dreadnoughts and other Imperial forces demonstrates sophisticated tactical integration. Unlike some war machines that operate independently or require elaborate support structures, Custodian dreadnoughts enhance the effectiveness of nearby units simply through their presence. Space Marines fight better knowing that if the line breaks, a golden war machine will be there to restore it. Imperial Guard soldiers hold ground they might otherwise abandon because they've seen what happens to orcs who face these golden giants. This morale boost isn't merely inspirational or symbolic. When Imperial forces know they have a Custodian dreadnought supporting them, they fight with greater confidence, take calculated risks they might otherwise avoid, execute complex maneuvers that require perfect timing because they trust that the dreadnought will be exactly where it needs to be, exactly when it needs to be there. This enhanced combat effectiveness multiplies the Custodian dreadnought's impact beyond what it could achieve fighting alone. The targeting priority that orcs assign to Custodian dreadnoughts reveals their terror of these war machines. Normally, orcs will happily charge the most dangerous-looking target, seeing it as a challenge and an opportunity to prove their strength. But when Custodian dreadnoughts appear on the battlefield, orc behavior changes noticeably. Many orcs will actively avoid engaging these golden nightmares, even if it means leaving their flanks exposed or abandoning defensive positions. Those orcs that do engage Custodian dreadnoughts often do so not out of enthusiasm, but out of desperation, or because they've been ordered to by their war boss. The difference in motivation shows in their combat effectiveness. They fight not to win, but to survive, hoping to inflict enough damage to drive the dreadnought away rather than expecting to actually destroy it. This defensive mindset is the antithesis of how orcs normally approach combat and represents a fundamental psychological defeat before the first shot is even fired. The long-term strategic effects of Custodian dreadnought deployments against orc territories show interesting patterns. Regions where these golden war machines have operated extensively tend to see reduced Ork activity for extended periods afterward. The survivors carry genetic memory of defeat, spawn new Orks with that same inherited caution, and gradually the entire local Ork population becomes less aggressive, less prone to forming large wagyers, more likely to fragment into smaller, more manageable groups. This creates opportunities for systematic pacification that wouldn't exist otherwise. Imperial forces can follow up Custodian Dreadnought deployments with sustained pressure against the demoralized Ork populations, gradually reducing their numbers and preventing the formation of new ways. What might have required decades of brutal warfare to achieve can sometimes be accomplished in years when Custodian forces are available to break the initial Ork resistance. The tactical flexibility of Custodian Dreadnoughts allows them to adapt to widely varying battlefield conditions. In urban combat, they can navigate through streets and buildings using their superior sensors and skills to avoid ambushes while systematically clearing Ork-held structures. In open terrain, they can serve as mobile fortresses around which Imperial battle lines form. In void warfare, they can be deployed via boarding action to cripple Ork capital ships from within. This versatility makes them invaluable assets that can be committed to any type of operation with confidence that they'll excel. Perhaps most importantly, the mere existence of Custodian Dreadnoughts in the Imperial arsenal serves as a strategic deterrent. Ork war bosses planning their must consider the possibility that they'll encounter these golden nightmares. Some will dismiss the risk, too confident in their own strength or too eager for a good fight to care. But others, particularly the cunning Bloodaxe bosses or those who have access to older Orks with genetic memory of previous defeats, will factor this threat into their strategic planning, potentially choosing targets or routes that seem less likely to draw Custodian attention. This deterrent effect extends the impact of Custodian Dreadnoughts far beyond the actual number of these war machines in service. Even if there are only a few dozen Custodian Dreadnoughts active across the entire Imperium at any given time, the fear they inspire affects Ork behavior across thousands of systems. The psychological shadow they cast is far larger than their physical presence, making them perhaps the most cost-effective weapon in the Imperium's arsenal when measured by the ratio of actual deployments to strategic influence. The tactical implications of Custodian Dreadnoughts, when fully understood and properly exploited, transform them from merely powerful war machines into tools of strategic importance that can alter the outcome of entire campaigns against Ork threats. The perpetuating legend. The terror that Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire in Orks isn't static, frozen in the events of Gyros Thravian and unchanging across the millennia. Instead, it's a living, evolving phenomenon that grows stronger with each encounter, each tale told around Ork campfires, each genetic memory passed down through fungal spores. Understanding how this legend perpetuates itself reveals why the fear has intensified rather than faded over 10,000 years of separation from its origins. Ork culture, such as it exists, is primarily oral and genetic. They don't write extensive histories or maintain detailed archives the way other species do. Their knowledge of the past comes primarily through two channels: genetic memory encoded in their spores, and stories passed between living Orks. Both of these mechanisms serve to amplify and reinforce the terror of Custodian Dreadnoughts in ways that written history never could. The genetic memory aspect is particularly fascinating because it operates below the level of conscious thought. An Ork doesn't remember Gyros Thravian the way a human might remember historical events they learned about in school. Instead, they carry an instinctive awareness, a feeling of profound wrongness when they encounter golden-armored warriors. This instinct predates their individual experience, exists before they've ever seen a Custodian, and cannot be reasoned away or overcome through force of will. When an Ork first encounters a Custodian Dreadnought, Something in their genetic code recognizes the threat. They might not be able to articulate why they're afraid, might not consciously understand the source of their terror, but they feel it nonetheless. This is a pattern recognition system operating at the most fundamental biological level, a warning system inherited from ancestors who survived previous encounters by fleeing rather than fighting. This genetic terror is then reinforced and amplified by actual experience. Those orcs who survive an encounter with a Custodian dreadnought carry that trauma with them, and when they eventually die and release spores that give birth to new orcs, those spores carry an imprint of that trauma. It's not a perfect transmission of memory. Orcs don't inherit specific details about individual battles, but they do inherit emotional imprints, instinctive reactions, warnings encoded at a level deeper than thought. Over 10,000 years, with countless encounters between Custodian forces and Ork waggies, this genetic memory has accumulated and intensified. The fear isn't based on a single event, but on thousands of reinforcing incidents, each one adding another layer to the instinctive terror that orcs feel when facing these golden nightmares. The oral tradition aspect works differently, but serves the same purpose of perpetuating and amplifying the legend. Orcs love to tell stories about their fights, about the enemies they've faced, and the battles they've won. These tales serve multiple social functions. They establish hierarchy, they pass along tactical knowledge, they reinforce cultural values about strength and courage, but they also serve as warnings, as cautionary tales about threats that orcs should approach with care or avoid entirely. Stories about Custodian dreadnoughts occupy a unique place in this oral tradition because they're not the typical orc bragging about victories. Instead, they're survival stories, tales told by the lucky few who encountered these golden war machines and lived to tell about it. These stories don't end with, "and then I crumped a git," but rather, "and then I ran, and that's why I'm still alive to tell you about it." The structure of these stories follows recognizable patterns that anthropologists studying orc culture have documented. They begin with the teller describing a successful wag, a proper fight where the boys were winning and everything was going according to plan. Then the Custodian dreadnought appears, and the tone of the story shifts dramatically. The bragging stops, replaced by descriptions that border on the poetic for orcs, attempts to convey the sheer wrongness of these enemies, their impossible strength, their unstoppable advance, their complete indifference to the orc opposition. These stories circulate through orc society, passing from veteran to young orc, from one wag to another, mutating and evolving in the telling, but maintaining their essential message. The golden giants are death. They cannot be beaten. They should be avoided. Each telling reinforces the legend, adds new embellishments, makes the Custodian dreadnoughts seem even more terrifying than they already are. This oral tradition creates something unusual in orc culture, a consensus enemy, a threat that even different clans who normally fight each other can agree should be avoided. Bloodaxes tell stories about trying to use their tactical cunning against Custodian dreadnoughts and failing. Goths share tales about their best fighters being obliterated without landing a single blow. Death Skulls recount attempts to loot golden armor that ended in disaster. Evil Sons describe trying to outrun these war machines and discovering that even their fastest vehicles couldn't escape. The cumulative effect of all these stories is to create a mythology around Custodian dreadnoughts that transcends factual description. The war machines become almost supernatural entities in orc consciousness, avatars of unstoppable death, enemies that exist outside the normal rules of combat. This mythologization actually serves to increase the terror because it makes Custodian dreadnoughts seem like forces of nature rather than merely powerful enemies. The legend also perpetuates through orc defeats and extinctions. When an entire wag is destroyed by Imperial forces that include Custodian Dreadnoughts, those Orks don't just die. They fail to reproduce, fail to pass on their genetic material, fail to contribute to the next generation of greenskins. This creates a form of evolutionary pressure where Orks who don't fear Custodians are more likely to die without spawning new Orks, while those who do fear them are more likely to survive and reproduce. Over thousands of years and millions of encounters, this selective pressure reinforces the genetic memory of fear. The Ork species as a whole becomes more cautious around Custodian forces because the Orks who weren't cautious didn't survive to pass on their genes. It's evolution in action, shaping Ork behavior to avoid threats that consistently prove fatal. The visual distinctiveness of Custodian Dreadnoughts contributes to the legend's perpetuation. These war machines are immediately recognizable, impossible to mistake for any other type of Imperial war engine. The golden armor catches the light, stands out on any battlefield, creates an iconic image that becomes seared into the memory of anyone who sees it. Orks don't need to be told they're facing a Custodian Dreadnought. They can see it, and that visual recognition triggers all the associated fears and warnings encoded in their genetic memory. This visual distinctiveness also makes stories about Custodian Dreadnoughts more credible and more impactful. When an Ork tells a story about facing a big golden stomper what killed hundreds of dayboys, their listeners can visualize exactly what they're describing because the image is so distinctive. This makes the stories more memorable, more likely to be retold, more effective at transmitting the warning to new generations. The legend is further reinforced by the consistency of Custodian Dreadnought performance across different engagements. If sometimes Orks managed to defeat these war machines, if there were tales of cunning war bosses who found ways to overcome them, the legend might weaken over time. But the historical record shows overwhelming consistency. Custodian Dreadnoughts win, Orks die, the golden war machines remain undefeated. This perfect record serves to validate and strengthen the genetic warnings, confirms that the fear is justified, provides no counter-narrative that might reduce the terror. The rarity of Custodian Dreadnoughts paradoxically enhances their legendary status. If these war machines were common, if every Imperial force fielded several, they might become normalized, just another enemy type that Orks had to deal with. But their scarcity, the fact that most Orks will never encounter one in their lifetime, keeps them special, keeps them terrifying, preserves their status as exceptional threats. This rarity also means that when Custodian Dreadnoughts do appear, it's a significant event, a moment that stands out in Ork memory and becomes worthy of stories. The appearance of one of these golden giants transforms an ordinary battle into a legendary encounter, something that Orks who survive will talk about for the rest of their lives and pass down to their spawned offspring through genetic memory. The integration of Custodian Dreadnoughts into broader Ork concepts about the Imperium also perpetuates the legend. Orks understand that the Imperium is led by a powerful figure they call the Big Yumi Boss, referring to the Emperor. They know that this leader has special warriors, exceptional even by the standards of the already dangerous Space Marines. When they encounter Custodian Dreadnoughts, they incorporate them into this understanding as the ultimate expression of the Emperor's power, the most dangerous enemies they might ever face. This contextualization makes the fear of Custodian Dreadnoughts more profound because it ties them to the broader Ork understanding of Imperial power structure. They're not just powerful war machines, they're direct representatives of the Emperor's will, instruments of the biggest boss in the galaxy, warriors who embody everything that makes the Imperium dangerous. This association amplifies their psychological impact beyond what their raw combat capabilities alone would justify. The legend also grows through misattribution. Any particularly devastating Imperial victory, any encounter with exceptionally effective golden-armored warriors, tends to get attributed to Custodian Dreadnoughts in Ork tales, even if no Dreadnoughts were actually present. This inflation of the legend, while not factually accurate, serves to increase the psychological impact of actual Custodian dreadnoughts when they do appear. Perhaps most importantly, the legend perpetuates because it's true. The terror isn't based on exaggeration or myth divorced from reality. Custodian dreadnoughts really are as dangerous as the legends claim, really do destroy Ork forces with the overwhelming efficiency that stories describe, really are nearly impossible to defeat or even significantly damage. When new Orks encounter these war machines for the first time, their experience validates and reinforces the warnings they've inherited genetically and heard in stories. The legend proves itself true with each encounter, ensuring its continued transmission to future generations. This self-reinforcing nature means the legend can only grow stronger over time. Each encounter adds to the body of evidence, provides new stories to tell, creates new genetic memories to pass on. 10,000 years of encounters haven't diminished the terror. They've concentrated it, refined it, made it an inescapable aspect of Ork psychology that will persist as long as both species continue to exist. The Custodian dreadnoughts have become, in Ork consciousness, something more than enemies. They are harbingers of doom, symbols of everything Orks cannot overcome, living proof that there are forces in the galaxy against which strength and numbers mean nothing. They are the exception to the rule that any enemy can be beaten if you just hit them hard enough. They are, in the most fundamental sense, the enemy that proves Ork philosophy wrong. And that legend, that knowledge, that terror will echo through Ork genetic memory until the end of time itself. Conclusion. In the grim darkness of the far future, where war is eternal and mercy is a weakness that cannot be afforded, the terror that Custodian dreadnoughts inspire in Orks stands as a testament to the power of perfection over brute strength, of skill over enthusiasm, of ancient purpose over savage aggression. We have journeyed through the many facets of this fear, from its foundation in the genetic memory of Gyros Thravian to its perpetuation through countless encounters across 10 millennia of warfare. The Orks were engineered by the Old Ones to be the perfect warriors, creatures who live for combat and know no fear of death. Yet when they face Custodian dreadnoughts, these golden avatars of the Emperor's wrath, even their engineered courage falters. This isn't because Custodian dreadnoughts simply kill more efficiently, though they certainly do that. It's because they represent something that strikes at the very core of Ork psychology, challenging every assumption greenskins hold about combat, strength, and victory. Where Orks believe that might makes right, Custodian dreadnoughts demonstrate that perfection trumps raw power. Where greenskins rely on numbers to overwhelm their enemies, these golden war machines prove that quality can defeat any quantity. Where Orks find joy in the chaos of battle, Custodians bring cold, precise execution that drains all pleasure from combat. The collision between these philosophies doesn't result in an interesting contest or a close fight. It results in systematic obliteration of the Ork forces with such overwhelming efficiency that it breaks their collective psyche. The physical superiority of Custodian dreadnoughts, their advanced technology and superior construction, provides the foundation for this dominance. Their auramite armor shrugs off attacks that would cripple lesser war machines. Their weapons eliminate threats with surgical precision. Their speed and agility defy expectations about how something so massive should move. But these physical advantages, impressive as they are, only tell part of the story. The psychic and spiritual presence of the entombed Custodian creates an aura that disrupts the wag energy sustaining Ork morale. The absolute certainty of purpose radiating from these warriors crashes against the chaotic enthusiasm of greenskin psychology and shatters it. The wag field that normally makes Orks fearless and effective instead becomes contaminated with doubt and fear, creating cascading failures that ripple through entire Ork formations. The warrior within the machine, with their millennia of accumulated experience and unmatched martial skill, transforms the Custodian Dreadnought from a powerful war machine into an unstoppable force of nature. They don't just fight orcs, they dominate them so completely that the greenskins can't even comprehend what's happening to them, can't learn from the experience because the gap in capability is too vast to bridge. The historical pattern stretching from Gyros Thravian through the War of the Beast and into the current Dark Age shows remarkable consistency. Every encounter reinforces the lesson. Custodian Dreadnoughts are death incarnate. They cannot be beaten. They should be avoided at all costs. This consistent track record prevents the fear from fading, ensures that each new generation of orcs inherits the same warnings, the same terror, the same genetic imperative to flee rather than fight these golden nightmares. The tactical and strategic implications extend far beyond individual battles. These war machines can turn the tide of entire campaigns, break wars that threatened entire sectors, save worlds that would otherwise fall to the green tide. Their mere existence serves as a deterrent, affecting orc behavior across the galaxy, even in regions where they've never actually been deployed. And the legend grows stronger with each passing century, each new encounter, each story told and genetic memory passed on. The Custodian Dreadnoughts have transcended their physical reality to become something almost mythological in orc consciousness. Symbols of everything greenskins cannot overcome, proof that their philosophy of strength through aggression has limits they cannot exceed. For the Imperium, these golden war machines represent one of the most effective weapons in its vast arsenal against the orc threat. For the orcs, they represent something far more profound and terrifying: the limits of their own existence, the boundaries beyond which their strength and numbers cannot take them, the living proof that there are forces in the galaxy they were never designed to defeat. The Emperor's golden guardians, even when their bodies have failed and they've been entombed in walking sarcophagi of blessed auramite, continue to serve their ancient purpose. They protect humanity not just through their martial prowess, but through the terror they inspire in one of humanity's most persistent enemies. Every orc who flees from a Custodian Dreadnought, every wag that breaks apart in their presence, every greenskin war boss who chooses to avoid these golden giants represents a victory for the Imperium, lives saved and worlds preserved. In the eternal war that defines the 41st millennium, where humanity stands besieged on all sides by countless enemies, the Custodian Dreadnoughts shine as beacons of hope and instruments of terror. They remind us that even in this dark age, the Emperor's finest warriors continue their vigil, that perfection forged in ancient days still has the power to shape the present, that some enemies inspire such profound fear that even the most battle-crazed orcs will turn and flee rather than face them. This is why orcs fear ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts, and this is why that fear will persist as long as both species endure. It's a fear written in genes and reinforced by bitter experience, a terror that transcends individual orcs and touches the species as a whole, a warning passed down through countless generations that some enemies cannot be beaten, should not be fought, must be avoided at all costs. The golden giants walk, and the green tide breaks before them. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the terror that Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire in orcs, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Your support helps us continue exploring the rich lore of Warhammer 40,000, bringing you detailed examinations of the factions, battles, and legendary warriors that make this universe so compelling. Share this video with your fellow Warhammer fans. Leave a comment sharing your own thoughts about Custodian Dreadnoughts and their impact on the greenskin menace, and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. The Emperor protects, and in his name, we continue to explore the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, in a galaxy of horrors, the Golden Warriors stand eternal.